Welcome to Equestrian Adventuresses, the podcast show for women who love horses, travel, and adventure. I'm your host, Crystal Kelly, and in today's episode, I know it's been a little while, sorry ladies, but I've been traveling around a little bit, and in today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with an amazing adventuress. Her name is Jodie. She's actually from Australia, and she's ridden 1,000 kilometers across Australia, and if that wasn't enough, she went again to America and rode part of the CDT Trail, which was covering part of Wyoming and Colorado, and she explains it all in the podcast, obviously, but she took a couple of horses, and she's had pack horses. She's been pretty self-sufficient, and her stories are just amazing, so you're going to want to stick around and listen to this episode. She gives a lot of really good advice as well, and yeah, it's just a really fun episode. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank you guys for listening to this podcast show. We're closing up on the year. It's now December. You know, if you're listening to this podcast after the holidays, I still want to wish you, happy holidays and a happy new year. And I hope everyone for 2020, you have amazing horse travel adventures. And if you would love to come on to the show, I'm happy to interview you. So, if you have any adventures coming up or if you've already done some adventures, be sure to contact me. You can find me at equestrianadventuresses.com, and I would love to hear from you. I would love to interview you and have you on the podcast show. Now, I've already mentioned some of my current horse travels. I was actually riding across Ireland, so that's why I haven't been able to update the podcast so much, but I would love to hear from you guys what type of shows that you would be interested in hearing as far as developing the podcast for the new year. So I do have some ideas, and I'm going to start maybe sharing my own personal stories because I know I've had some people definitely asking me to share my stories. So I'm going to start sharing some of my stories in future episodes, and I'm going to see if there's other maybe topics maybe you guys are interested in coming on the show and talking about, packing lists or just different topics and having discussions with really cool, interesting women. So if you're interested or if you have an idea or you just want to shout ideas, and I'll, do my best to make these podcast episodes for you. Again, you can reach out to me on Equestrian Adventuresses, or the best way is actually in the Facebook group. Go ahead and send me a message either on the Facebook page or say something in the group and say, hey, we want to see more of this in the podcast show. And also, lastly, my Christmas wish for you guys, if you love the podcast, please consider leaving us a review. It makes a big difference to help others to find the podcast show and, spread the cheer and share this podcast with other horse friends of yours, horse travel buddies of yours, and, if you've gotten good advice and tips and you've enjoyed the stories on the show, then they probably will too. So please leave us a review and share the podcast with at least 5 of your horsey friends, and that is my New Year's challenge for you. Okay, and without any further ado, hit it! We are explorers. We are trailblazers. We love to do what cannot be done. We love to test our limits, cross borders, and we love the freedom horses bring us. We seek lands without fences. Who are we? We are equestrian adventuresses. We are a community of women who love horses, travel, and adventure.
To infinity and beyond!
And now your host, Crystal Kelly.
Hello, everyone, and today I am talking to Jodie. And Jodie, do you want to just go ahead and give us a little introduction about yourself and where you're from?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, as you said, my name's Jodie. I'm from Australia, and so recently I've been doing a couple of pack trips. Last year I was riding in Australia. I rode from Melbourne up to Canberra, which was about 1,000 kilometers. And this year I've been hanging out in the United States riding the Continental Divide Trail. I did a couple of sections of that through Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, and did about another 1,200 Ks of that. So in a nutshell, that has been my journey for the last 12 months.
So now that you've properly intimidated everybody,
I didn't mean to do that.
no. Tell us a little bit about your. I mean, obviously, those are super incredible experiences, but you must have started somewhere. So, what was your? I don't know. How did you get started with horses, and how did it evolve into this? Hey, I'm gonna do these grand travel adventures.
So growing up, I was one of those annoying kids that was always like, can we go see horses? Can we pet the horses? Can we go feed the horses? And mum and dad made this terrible mistake when I was 2 years old of moving into a house that was opposite horse adjustment. So they were pretty much doomed from that time onwards. And my grandpa just like put the final nail in the coffin when I was 5 and took me for my first riding lesson. And from there it was all downhill or uphill, I guess, depending on who you ask. I reckon it's uphill. Poor dad reckons it's like just a straight downward slope. But I grew up kind of doing the kick, go, pull, stop kind of riding lessons once a week. And then when I was 16, I got my first horse, and so was riding pretty consistently from that time onwards. And took a little bit of a break when I went to college. But yeah, then I was growing up doing dressage and show jumping, which kind of it was really good, and I'm really, really glad that that was my my basis for riding, like kind of my foundation. And then when I was 16, mum and dad took us for a trip, and we went to Jackson Hole in Wyoming, and I saw all these ranch horses hanging out in the winter in the snow, and I decided that I really, really wanted to come back and try and work on a ranch one day. And so when I was 24, I went over to Colorado and worked on a ranch for what was supposed to be one summer. And then 3 summers, 3 falls, and a winter later, I finally came home and decided to try and be an adult. And so I was at Hewlett-Packard working as an account manager, which is a little bit of a different office than the 11,500 acres I had in Colorado. However, there were a couple of things that happened in my last year over at the ranch and while I was working at HP there that kind of changed everything. And I know that just the world has a funny way of working, and I had no idea that this was going to be the direction that I would end up taking. But in a nutshell, on my last year at the ranch, one of my friends and co-workers passed away from suicide. And then the following year, while I was working at HP, my grandma, I lost her to the same thing, unfortunately. And that kind of hit me pretty hard. And I did that whole, that silly thing of just going through and making up hypothetical conversations about things I should have done, or I should have said, or I could have done this. And if I'd done this, it would have been different. And it was just kind of this big cycle of just, yeah, it was useless because I couldn't change anything. I couldn't go back, and I was just making myself miserable, blaming myself and thinking about it. And then one day I kind of metaphorically slapped myself across the face and was like, rather than sitting here feeling sorry for yourself, go out and do something about it. And the link between my friend and my grandma was that they were both really passionate about horses, and they both lived in rural environments. And I'd heard of this trail that runs up the east coast of Australia called the Bicentennial National Trail. It runs for 5,330 kilometres, give or take, or 3,300 miles. And so I decided that that would be a great way to chat about mental health if I rode that. So then it was kind of like a little bit of a tribute to them. So before I knew it, I'd gotten a crash course in packing and was setting off along the BNT. But unfortunately, I got cut off after about 1,000 kilometers because the drought was just getting really bad. And so my water sources weren't really reliable. On one of the last days out there, I was supposed to have 8 river crossings, and all but 2 of them were bone dry. So I decided, just for more of like a safety thing for the horses, I wanted to make sure that I had water because I had 3 horses for that trip. And so I pulled off trail after about 1,000 Ks, and then was sitting there thinking, well, I can't just twiddle my thumbs for however long it takes for it to rain again. So then one of my friends had done the Continental Divide Trail last year. And so I decided that was my plan B. And within about 6 weeks, I was over in the States, starting to plan my route and my water sources and my campsites for that, and grabbed a truck and trailer and horses and set on out. So that's kind of from the 2-year-old me through till now.
So this let's go back a little bit. This trip, this bicentennial one, is in Australia, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
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 So how do you prepare for something like that? Like, I can imagine the conversation you must have had with your parents. Like, hey, I'm going to go on this 5,000-kilometer journey, and I'm going to bring a pack horse, and they're like, what? So how did that conversation begin, and what sort of preparations did you make before the journey even began?
Well, no one else in my family is really horsey at all. So the conversation wasn't really a proper conversation for a while. Mum and Dad just didn't really want to hear it. But after a while, they kind of got their head around the idea. I think Mum was more upset with me that I was quitting my career again than the fact that I was going to be going out in the bush by myself with horses. But pretty much I just turned around and said, hey, this is what I'm going to do. And they were less than happy with me to start with. They're completely on board now, which is really, really awesome. But I had no idea where to start initially because I'd never done anything like this. I'd never packed a horse for a day in my life. And so I kind of set out trying to figure out where to begin. So I first started looking at the BNT trail, and the BNT is really, really cool in that there's guidebooks for the entire trail. It's split up into 12 guidebooks, which cover, a bit under, probably in between 300 and 500 Ks per book. And the BNT is split up into sections within those guidebooks. So you'd have section coordinators, and they can go from anywhere from 100-kilometer section of the trail up to, I can't remember the biggest one, but it's a couple of 100 Ks. And so they know their section of the trail really, really well. So first off, I just got the guidebooks, had a look at where I was going, and then started reaching out to the section coordinators, excuse me, just to say, hey, I'm going to be coming through here. This is my approximate timeline. And then I talked to as many people as I could find that had done the BNT before and just got an idea of what I was in for. And because I'd spent a bit of time over in the States already, I had friends over there that had done packing. I have one friend in particular that was an outfitter in Alaska and Montana for, 30 plus years. And so I ended up back over in the States, and he taught me how to pack. So we did a big crash course. I kind of reached out to him and was like, help me. And so he was cutting hay at that time. He took a couple of days off haying, which was really, really lovely, and just gave me an entire course. Everything from saddling up a pack horse to tying up loads to how you pack and balance your loads and all of the different hitches. So I used a Decker pack saddle. There's a couple of different ones. There's the Decker that I use, where you can use ropes and tie all your hitches and loads on that way. And then there's the Australian pack saddle that I honestly haven't really had much experience with. And then you have the Sawbuck. So I learnt on the Decker, and he ended up actually loaning me his Decker saddle, which was really, really great. And so, I just kind of went from there and learnt new hitches, and I learnt the hard way. Once I had a pretty big wreck, once I'd changed my top pack and had tried to use the hitches that I'd used on my previous loads. And so it's been a big, big learning curve. But I think when you're out there doing it every day, you have to adapt. And I was really stubborn there for a little bit. So don't be me if you're learning to pack. Make sure you adapt your hitches to what loads you have.
And how many horses did you bring on this trip?
So the first trip for the BNT, I had 3 horses, and I would rotate them around a little bit. So I had my main riding horse, and after a while I kind of figured out my string and who did what job the best. So I had my main riding horse, who was an Appaloosa mare named Phoenix, and behind her I would usually have Costa, who was my main pack horse. He packed most of the actual trip gear. And then behind him, I usually had Cece, who was carrying all of the horse stuff. So I had all my horse feed and rugs, and she would carry all of that. And I did rotate them around a little bit. And so there were a couple of days where I rode Cece instead, and a couple of days where I rode Costa. But I kind of figured out quite quickly that that was the way that my team worked the best.
And were these horses you had prior to thinking about this adventure, or did you buy these horses just for this trip?
So I actually had a horse that I was going to take with me, and that was prior to planning all of this. Unfortunately, I didn't end up being able to take her. She had a paddock accident a month before I left, but so I couldn't take her. But all the other three, Costa was my grandpa's horse, but he hadn't really had anything done with him. He'd only had about 6 rides on him, and he'd been broken in about 2 years prior, and he'd just been living the life out in the paddock. And Fee and Cece I only got about 2 months before setting out. So it was a lot of work having to go through all of them and teach them to hobble and teach them about the electric fence that I used most of the time when I was out there, teaching them to highline, and just more of the trail skills that we needed out there. But yeah, so I didn't really have them for very long before I set out. It was it's funny how fast time goes when you've got a big job like that. I thought I had plenty of time, and I did not.
And I find that really interesting because I was riding my 2 horses across Ireland, as a lot of the listeners will know. And these were my personal horses that I had for a couple of years. So I had already sort of built that relationship with them, and I knew their personalities, and I knew what they would do good at and what they might struggle with. But here you are kind of with these horses, and you're trying to figure them out, and you're trying to figure out how to pack and this and that. And I can imagine that it was kind of a lot of stress leading up to your big day. Did you have any second thoughts or doubts or worries or?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, I had the nerves leading up to it. I think it's silly if you don't go into something like that with at least a little bit of nervousness because, I was just being realistic that, like you said, I didn't know my horses that well yet. We did spend a lot of time together leading up to this trip, but I think the nerves were more like I just had never done anything like this before. I did a practice ride before I went out, which was 4 days. But aside from that, I didn't really get out there for extended periods of time before this one big trip, which in hindsight, I would definitely not do again. I would definitely go and do a lot of smaller trips, and because the smaller trips were where you kind of figure out what you need to adjust and what things are working or what things aren't working. But yeah, no, I felt pretty good about these horses. I really, really lucked out with them. They're just phenomenal. So Phoenix, I didn't even intend on getting. My grandpa wanted to go out and have a look at a horse trailer. And when I say grandpa, he's technically not blood related, but that's the role that he holds in my life. So that's the title that he gets. And so he wanted to go out and have a look at a horse trailer, and I just came along to go out and go with him. And the lady that was selling it turned around and said, "Hey, I've got this horse in the paddock. It's just been sitting there for the past 2 years. I don't really want it anymore. It's just costing me money and feed. Do you want it?" And I was like, well, yeah. I had no idea about the background of this horse. I was just like, yeah, I'm going to do a big trip soon. I need horses. So yes. And so we went out to have a look at a horse trailer and came home with a horse on the trailer. And I didn't know what this horse had done. I didn't know if it was broken in or, I still know nothing about her past, but she ended up being my lead horse and she's absolutely phenomenal. Costa was just hanging out in the paddock at my grandpa's place. And he's like, well, he needs a couple of miles on him. Take him. It's like, okay, cool. And Cece, I actually impulse bought sight unseen off Gumtree, which is Australia's version of Craigslist. And so this all sounds really, really irresponsible now that I say it out loud, but it all just worked out so well. I mean, I did put a lot of work into these horses before I took off, and I obviously wouldn't have taken them if I didn't think that they were capable or if I didn't think that I was safe, but all 3 of them just have the most amazing minds. And they tried their hearts out for me. I never really had any doubts about taking any of them. I did have a fifth horse that I didn't end up taking. So I bought him off a couple of people that had already done the trail. So he'd done 4,000 kilometers of the B&T already. And then he just didn't end up suiting me as well as the other guys. And he had a slightly sore back after the practice ride. So I decided to leave him behind. But other than that, the horses that I took were just really, really lovely. And I couldn't have asked for better horses, to be honest.
So as far as the trail and the terrain that you would be facing, I mean, I know you said it was kind of cut short because of a drought, but when you were packing, what was your, I don't know, what kind of things did you need to pack in order to survive this trail? So you mentioned you needed feed, but like how many days worth of food for you and your horses are you carrying? How far are you going without civilization? I mean, what was your plan for how you would source horse feed and food for yourself and everything like that?
So the two trips that I took, the one in Australia versus the one in the States, were very, very different. There's actually very few things that I have in common between those two. So with my Australian trip, the Victorian section, which was, gosh, I reckon the first 700 Ks or so, I need to go and check that number again, but it seems to be about that from memory. So I had really, really good feed. And so I actually didn't resupply for 27 days for my first trip. And so the terrain that we were going through was the Alpine region, really, or like the high country of Victoria. So it was a lot of four-wheel drive tracks, and oh my gosh, some of them, like, switchbacks don't exist. I don't know what they were doing when they made them, but I feel like the bulldozer just went like straight up the side of the mountain for some of them. So it was really, really steep, but absolutely beautiful. I really, really want to get out there and do it again, but hold on, sorry, I just completely lost track of what I was saying.
About, how you sort of packed your gear to, are you having enough food supplies?
Right.
Or yeah.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. All right, I'll give you like a couple of seconds pause so you can edit it easier, and then I'll start talking again. I just packed all of my feed for this first ride on my pack horse, and I'd gone through and dehydrated pretty much everything I could think of. So I'd gotten a dehydrator and I'd made up most of my own meals. I only had a handful of those freeze-dried meals, which I didn't even end up using. So the way that I broke my food down was I'd kind of have everything split up. So I'd have a protein and then like a carbohydrate and then veggies that were all separated. So each night I'd kind of look at what I have. And so I might grab, say, a dehydrated mince, and then I might grab some rice that had already been cooked and then dehydrated, and I'd add that into my stove. And then I'd think, you know what, I feel like maybe carrots and corn and peas, and so I'd add that in and let that soak for a little bit and then cook that, and that would be dinner. So that would change every night. As far as the horses feed went, the B&T for that first Victorian section did have a lot of grass, and so I was really lucky with that. And I also carried this feed called copra, which is coconut based, and that was really, really glorious. I got that tip off a couple of people that had done the B&T before me, and they found that that was a really, really great feed to maintain weight on trail. And what that does is it actually, like when you feed it, you soak it out, and it at least doubles its size once you soak it. And so that was really, really great, because whatever feed I was carrying, like the amount that the horses were essentially getting was like the volume was almost double of what I could carry. And they loved that. But gosh, in that Victorian section, Costa, my pack horse, actually put on weight. And I didn't think that was possible for a long ride like that, but he proved me wrong. But other than that, I just carried everything that I needed out on trail. And my pack list has obviously evolved a lot since I started out. But the essentials that we carried were, like a tent, sleeping bag. I initially started out with a sleeping mat, and I discarded that pretty quickly and ended up sleeping on my horse saddle pads. which made pack up in the morning a little bit quicker as well. But we had first aid kits and my changes of clothes. I actually carried like a pair of town jeans and a town shirt. So whenever I was coming into town, I would wear those for the day instead of looking grotty. I'd look nice and fresh. And I would also carry this little bag. It's called a scrubber. And it's like a little dry bag, but it's got these little knobbly bits on the inside, and it's kind of acts like a portable washing machine. So if I was having rest days on trail, then I would go out, and assuming it was nice and sunny, which most of the time it was on that first trip, then I would be able to do laundry and just kind of chill out for the day and get all the chores done.
And so how many months did both of these rides take you, and how much so, you said you carried all of your food and everything, so that means you're packing for several months, I'm going to imagine, worth of food and supplies.
Yeah, so for that first ride, I packed about 4 weeks worth of food, and for me, and I started out with about 20 kilos of copra for the horses, which actually lasted a really, really long time. I didn't have to feed them too much, especially for that first month that I was out on trail, because we did have such great grazing everywhere that we went. So all up, my B&T ride took me just over 2 months for that 1,000 Ks. I did come off trail for a total of 2 weeks. Once I took a little side trip into Dargo, which is a little town in country Victoria. And that ended up being close on a week, because I was trying to catch up with a friend who was letting me use his place, and he kept getting called into work, and I didn't want to use his place and then leave again before he could get a day off to come and say hi. So I ended up spending a week in Dargo. And then while I was on trail, my grandpa had a minor stroke. So as soon as I found that out, I dropped everything and came off trail for a week to make sure that he was okay. So including those 2 weeks, it took just over 2 months. So I started on the 3rd of November and finished on the 10th of January for that B&T ride. And the CDT ride was a little bit more tricky, but I'm sure we'll get to that in due course.
So where were the horses sleeping at night? How did you said you had hobbles, but were you finding places for them, or how did that work?
Yep, so the B&T has designated campsites, and the B&T is really, really great. It's essentially set up for horses. So it was made with horses in mind. So I spoke about those guidebooks a little bit earlier, and the guidebooks are split up into pretty much 1 day's worth of riding. And some of those days are pretty short. Some of those days get pretty long. But they've got designated areas that are made sure that there are water sources nearby, and grazing. So everywhere that I went, especially for the first little bit, like I said, there was heaps of really good feed in there. And I would just set up an electric fence. So I carried polywire and a small energizer. I think it's the Speedrite AN20 or AN30. I'd have to go and double check that again. So I carried an electric fence set up, and initially I just used baling twine as insulators for around the trees. So I would tie a bit of baling twine and a loop in the baling twine and thread my electric fence through that and use the trees to make a perimeter, because I didn't have to camp above tree line at all for the B&T trip. So there were always trees available, and I just make a nice big temporary pasture for them overnight, and then in the morning pack it all up and take the baling twine off, and we'd keep going. And I would hobble my horses inside the electric fence just in case anything happened, the fence went down. The idea was they wouldn't go too far with hobbles on, but Cece's really, really good at hobbles. So it doesn't really slow her down at all, but it does help just a little bit. There was one night, and it was about midnight, and I was in my tent, and I just heard something really big outside, and something kind of started scratching on my tent. And being in the middle of nowhere, I was like, what on earth is that? And I look outside, and Cece's there being like, hey, good evening, what's going on? Just came to say hi. So she figured out that if she had a rug on or a blanket on, that she could get out of the electric fence. So it was a little bit handy having the hobbles there just to slow her down a little bit. And there were times where I did highline the horses as well. And there was a section there where there was a lot of wild horses around, a lot of brumbies, and I actually highlined inside an electric fence just to try and keep my horses separate from the brumbies, and then I knew that I'd have horses there the next day for sure because they were hard tied.
So what's the kind of terrain, and are they all sort of trails, or, what kind of footing are you on?
The majority of it was four-wheel drive tracks. And so it was cleared. There was only one time that I needed my trail saw to cut through a tree that was over the trail. But it did get very steep in sections. I remember there was one day and it was going up towards Mount Howard. So I was one day's ride away from Howard Hut on top of Mount Howard, which was one of the high points of the trail that I was on for that Australian section. And gosh, it was so steep. I think I was going about maybe 30 meters at a time and then having a break. So for the really steep sections, I would get off and walk because I figured that if I needed a break, the horses probably did too. And I just remember that day being really, really steep, and I hadn't tied Cece on, like I hadn't properly pigged her to Costa that day. So when I say pigged, I would have her tied to the back of Costa's pack saddle, but just on a little breakaway. So if anything happened, she'd be able to get loose pretty quickly. And I just hadn't tied her on properly, and she just kind of was like, not feeling it. And she just stayed down the bottom, and I didn't realize for a while. And so I got my other two horses up the top, saw her, and then muttered some choice words under my breath and had to walk all the way back down and walk her up again. But, it's just really, really nice terrain going up there. Like I said, some of it's like a little bit steep and it's a bit challenging, but it's really well marked out trail, and there's markers, like BNT markers along the way that you see every now and again that just remind you that, yep, you're on the right track and you haven't gotten too far lost yet.
So I can imagine, I know that this is a lot of hard work. Yes, you're doing it for fun, but obviously you have to pack and unpack and, all of this stuff. And so you're coming to the end of your journey, and you said that, there was this drought and you had to make this big decision to end your trip a bit earlier than you thought. Were you feeling defeated and sad, or were you kind of, obviously you decided to do it again in America, but were you kind of like thankful, like, yay, the journey's kind of over, now I can shower, or, were you kind of missing that feeling of being on the road?
So before I headed out on trail, I had other people warn me of this thing, like both hikers, riders, everyone that's kind of been out on a long trip. I got warned that there was this thing called trail depression when you came off trail. And I was like, yeah, whatever. Like, it's cool. It'll be fine. Like, I'll be fine. It's a thing. It hurt in my chest how much I missed being on trail when I came off it. And I think the only thing that stopped me from getting like really down in the dumps about being off trail was the fact that I was now in panic stations, having to figure out what I was going to do about planning this next one. And yeah, I missed it so much. So I don't know if you've ever experienced like really bad homesickness. I definitely have. When I was overseas, there was one time I went on a trip and I just wasn't really ready to go. It's a long story, but I got to the States and I was so homesick for the first week, and that's kind of how it felt coming off trail.
Yeah. So I can definitely relate. I think that's one of the things about travelers. I've lived in probably 20 countries, and I felt homesick for all of those places. Mm-hmm. And I think I've revisited the amount of countries I've revisited more than once. I probably could have just gone and seen every country in the world, but I always just love to go back to places that I've already been because I feel like I'm coming home. And I think that's a great point that you make. In the beginning, especially someone from the outside, they might look at your journey like, oh man, that's hard work. But to actually live it, I think, is an experience. So what to you, I don't know, maybe you have a story or something that really sort of captures the essence of what it's like to live on the road and to do something as grand as this.
Well, I don't want to make it out for a second like it's this amazing romantic journey and everything's all happy and bubbly, and I loved every second, because there were times there where I definitely, like, I looked up at the sky. I'm like, what are you doing? This is the stupidest idea you have ever had. And oh my gosh, there were a couple of times there where I just didn't want to do it and I wanted to quit, but I couldn't because I was in the middle of nowhere. Um, Especially one morning where I started out and we had this huge climb, like right up to the top of Mount Terrible, which is aptly named, by the way. And I'd kind of gotten on my horse, and Fee, that lead mare that I had, she was just like, she wasn't lame, but she was just like a little bit off. She just wasn't stepping up in that knee hind as much as I like would have liked and as much as was normal. And it took, oh gosh, like 5 hours to do 10 kilometers, I think it was. And it was just up the entire time. I think we gained like almost a kilometer of elevation over that time. And it was just absolutely brutal. And Costa and Cece just were like nitpicking at each other that day. Like Cece would be randomly biting his butt, so he'd shoot forward and then yank me. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, stop it, just behave. And then we got to the top and she was kind of chasing him. I was worried about Fee. I'd done the entire thing on foot. In my riding boots, which ended up being the best hiking boots I've ever had, funnily enough. But I was just tired and sore, and we'd only done 10 kilometers after 5 hours, and I still had 20-something Ks left to do that day, up and down some really, really steep terrain. I just remember getting to the top and looking at the sky and being like, why am I here? But at the end of the day, I think it's those parts, the really, really tough parts, that make it all worth it, because it's the ones that you really need to work for that give you the biggest sense of accomplishment. And so this is going to sound a little bit funny, but I was watching this show the other day, and one of the guys there was talking about these levels of fun. And he's like, there's this scale of fun where you have things that aren't really fun and things that are really, really fun. He's like, at the very bottom of that scale, like a 1 out of 10 are roller coasters. Because you're like, yay, it was fun at the time, but you never really look back on life and be like, man, how great was that roller coaster? He's like, it's very, it's specific to like that one point in time. Whereas things like this, when you're out and you're hiking and it's kind of a little bit miserable there for a little bit, but you push through and you end up making it, you can look back on that and just be like, how much fun was that? And it's something that carries forward. And I think that is so true, because there's a couple of days like that trip up Mount Terrible where it was tough and I was tired, I was exhausted, and I was hungry, and physically exhausted, mentally exhausted. And I got through the end of that day and I just remember making it, and I just sat down on the ground at camp and I was just like, whoa, that was tough, but I made it. And it's such a good feeling. So I think it's moments like that where you're out there and they kind of get a little bit addictive, where you've just pushed yourself so hard and you made it, and it's just, that really, really cool feeling of accomplishment. And then you just want to keep doing it, and it becomes, I guess it's kind of like when you first start working out and you're really unfit and it's really, really tough, but you get through the end of every workout and you kind of want to just lie on the ground. And then after a while, when you start getting that strength up, it just gets better and better and better. And you get into this routine, and it's just, I think that's the best way I can describe it. That was probably really terrible. I'm sorry.
No, that was actually great. It actually kind of made me think of like this Monty Python, like, I've had worse, like the more that you kind of overcome, the more you're just like, bring it on, and what else do you got?
Yes.
So let's talk about then. So you did this big adventure, and then you want more, and you head on over to America. So how did this begin? How did you find horses? How did you where did this come from?
So one of my best friends is Gillian Larson, and she's done Mexico to Canada on horseback 3 times. She's done the Pacific Crest Trail twice, and last year she did the Continental Divide Trail. And So I am absolutely blessed to be able to call her one of my friends. She is just an absolute wealth of knowledge, and I never would have even considered taking on the CDT if I didn't have her backing me. So when I couldn't do the BNT anymore, and I kind of had a little inkling that that might be the case before I first stepped out on trail, and so I was like, mentally I was kind of ready for it. But it was just actually getting to that point where the drought was really taking effect, and it was a lot harder to keep condition on my horses, that I was like, yep, cool, making the call, we're good, we're done. But I'd kind of messaged her and be like, so should I do the CDT? And her answer was, of course, like, duh, yes. And so
those are the friends that you need.
Yeah, exactly. The ones that are like, that's a stupid question. Of course you should. And another thing was, like mentioned earlier, like the whole point of me doing this long ride was to raise awareness for mental health and whatnot. And I didn't want to just like sit there and just stop because I ran into an obstacle. And so I was like, well, I quit my job for this. Like, I have to keep going. And so stopping wasn't really an option for me. And so I ended up flying out to stay with her for the first couple of weeks that I was in the States. And we went over the CDT route, and she taught me how to figure out how to look for good campsites and water sources and have a look at the data that we had. So there's this really, really amazing app called Guthook. And that has like the big three, so the Appalachian Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, and the Pacific Crest Trail has maps for them, as well as like maps for a bunch of other trails around the world, including like Australia and New Zealand, which is really, really cool. And so what Guthooks has is it's got a whole bunch of information on the trail, including water sources, and there are some designated campsites. And it's just got information on all of them. And as hikers go through each year, they can update the water source information. So it's really cool being able to go on the map and say, look, here's a water source, and go through the comments. And the comments from a couple of years ago will be like, yep, flowing well. Or from last year, especially because last year was a big drought year on the CDT, they'd be like, nope, only a trickle. Or at the start of the season, it's like, yep, flowing strong. And you can see through the comments how that water source is kind of just cut back, and some of them are like dry now. But if you go down an extra quarter mile, then there's water to the right-hand side of the trail there. So I was able to go through there and then have a look at what I thought my mileage was going to be each day, and then kind of make tentative plans for where I wanted to camp. And so I'd have a look at the water sources and try and plan there, but I would also look at the topographic maps to make sure that whatever campsite I was planning was flat, because obviously you'd like to have a flat campground if you're going to be camping with horses and also sleeping in a tent, because you don't want to be sliding all the way down all night. And I would also then, once I found a place that had a water source that looked flat, I would then double check the satellite images to make sure it looked like there was enough grazing there, which worked most of the time. Every now and then I'd come into a campsite that I thought I'd planned really well, and then it would just be that, like, a whole bunch of that green undergrowth that's not actually edible for horses, so I'd need to keep going. But I did make most of the time plans A, B, and C for each day. So if I got to one campsite and that wasn't looking as great as I thought, then I would either have a campsite lined up a couple of miles after, or I would usually have one lined up beforehand, so that if I wasn't making my miles for the day for whatever reason, if I'd run into downfall or just been going a little bit slower, if I'd gotten a late start or whatnot, then I'd have a campsite beforehand as well. So that was a lot of the planning for the CDT when it came to horses.
And I mean, so I'm American. Obviously, I understand it's a huge country. I know, like, my husband is visiting in America, and he's, like, mind blown at how big the country is. And, like, we have bears, and we have animals that can actually kill you. And, you know, so as far as stuff like that, you know, safety and the bears and, you know, all of this stuff, what was your thinking or thought process? I mean, I know you're Australian and you're pretty hardcore anyways, but, you know, did you have in the back of your mind, like, oh my gosh, what if there's a bear, or what if I don't know what?
So I think Mum was definitely convinced that I was going to get eaten by a grizzly bear. But I had it in my mind and I was always aware. But when I was out on trail, I just was really, really mindful to be aware but not afraid. And funnily enough, the time that I felt most uncomfortable about predators like mountain lions, bears, and whatnot was when I was in town, knowing I was about to go back out on trail. When I was on trail, I didn't really have that fear, and I'm not sure why that is. But when I was out there, I was always on the lookout, especially when I was around camp and I was like, thumping around, like getting firewood one day because I got snowed on so hard that day, and everything was wet, and I stopped early to make a fire to try and dry everything out. But yeah, I was always aware of my surroundings, but I never really felt scared or uncomfortable when I was out there. And I'm not sure why that is. I just feel a lot more relaxed when I'm out on trail than I do right beforehand when I'm about to go on it. So yeah, that didn't really affect me too much. And I had bear spray with me too, so I was feeling all right about that.
And a fast horse, I guess.
Yeah. Sounds pretty good.
Yeah. So how did the trail, how was it different than the trail you were used to in Australia? Like, what type of terrain were you facing? Were you just totally off of the grid sometimes, or what was that like?
So the biggest thing was that the trail, oh my gosh, the trail system in the States is just next level. It's just absolutely incredible. So the biggest difference was that in Australia, I was mostly on four-wheel drive tracks. So they were wide, they were kind of graded, but in the States, it was the majority of the time single track trails. And yeah, the terrain was completely different. Switchbacks existed, which means if we were climbing a lot in elevation, then it didn't seem quite as tough a lot of the time. I mean, there were a couple of places in Colorado that just absolutely kicked my butt. But most of the time we'd get through elevation changes a lot easier because there were switchbacks and it was gradual elevation as opposed to just like going straight up the side of a hill. There's places in the States that are just unlike anywhere I've ever been before, and they are just phenomenal. And like the national parks and state forests and just all of the access in there is just beautiful. And the condition of the trails a lot of the time is just amazing. I cannot thank trail crews enough. The people that go in there and clear trails. So there was a part of the Colorado Trail. So, sorry, let me go back a step. The Continental Divide Trail crosses over with the Colorado Trail for about 300 miles, give or take. And I remember riding through a part of that. There was a decent amount of avalanche damage there. And I'd run into a hiker 2 days before just saying, hey, like in a couple of days' time, you're going to get up to this like real section where it's going to be really hard to get through with horses. And that's one of the reasons I carried a trail saw with me everywhere that I went. But when I got there, there was this amazing couple that were a trail crew that had just spent the last couple of days clearing the trail. And so there was only one big tree that I helped them cut through. And the amount of times I saw like the trail had been cleared and like the big logs had been cut and moved aside, that I just sent a little prayer of thanks to all those trail crews that were out there maintaining the trails. So that's a really, really big difference. And yeah, so like I said, like the elevation changes were different. I got to go over a couple of 13,000 foot peaks on trail this time, and I think the highest peak in Australia is about 7,000. So it was a little bit different that way too.
And maybe I missed this detail, but did you have two horses in this journey, or how many horses did you have in America?
So I started out with two. And so Wyoming, I started out in the Red Desert in the basin of Wyoming, and then went through and did a section from Butte to Helena. And so I did those sections with two horses. And then Tigger, my pack horse, I also did the Bob Marshall Wilderness with Tigger as well. But he was a little bit older than my main riding horse, Thelma. And he just wasn't loving the big miles as much as Thelma was. So she walks out really, really fast, and she just goes all day, every day. And he kind of liked to mosey on a little bit, a little bit slower. And he liked maybe like the 15-mile days a lot better than, or like the kind of high 20s in kilometers, or like 30K days a lot better than he liked the 40K days or 25-mile days. And so there was one day in the Bob Marshall where I'm not quite sure what happened. We were just walking along, and it was the 4th of July. And so we were powering out. We just had a day off, and we were going down this relatively steep grade. It's a really narrow trail, and he just started kind of pulling back on that lead rope that I had, just leaning on it. And I looked back, and he just like wasn't walking right. And so I ended up stopping early that day and just giving him the rest of the day off. But he just wasn't loving it. So I ended up switching to one horse after that, because I couldn't find any other pack horse that would keep up with Thelma, because she walks out so fast. And I did the rest of Montana and all of Colorado on just one horse. So the long answer to your short question is I started out with 2 and I finished off with 1.
So then how much did you have to downsize? You had a pack horse, and then now you just have your riding horse carrying you and everything, I suppose. So what was that transition like, and did it slow you down a lot, or how did that work?
Yeah, switching from 2 horses to 1 horse was, like I said, just really expensive, because all of the gear that I had, it was really, really good, but because I had a pack horse, I didn't need to worry as much about making sure everything was super lightweight. And so when I was moving to 1 horse, I had to try and go as ultralight as possible. So a lot of the hikers that I was passing on trail were going ultralight, and I thought I was doing pretty light until I had to move to just 1 horse, and then I realized what ultralight really meant. So I had to get a new tent. I stuck with the sleeping bag or like quilt that I had that was already pretty light, new sleeping pad, and then anything that wasn't essential, I just had to completely cut out. So, and I tried to use as many things as possible for multiple purposes. So, for example, at night, Thelma, my main riding horse in the States, she would be picketed. And so rather than have a picketing rope, when I had Tigger still as the pack horse, I would use the ropes off my pack saddle as high lines if I needed to, or I just have the electric fence. But I had to cut all of that out. And so all I did was just carry a plastic, it's like a really, really tough one of those big orange screw ground stakes. And I would take apart her bridle every night and use my McCarty reins as her picket rope. So I try and use as much stuff as possible for multiple different uses, and just replacing all of my gear with ultralight stuff. So like I said, I got rid of my tent, I changed up my sleeping mat, I changed up my stove, and then I just had my clothes in a little Ziploc bag. So I just had a change of socks and jocks, and then a thermal top and thermal leggings for sleeping at night, and a beanie, and otherwise it was just whatever I was wearing and that. And I actually put myself on food rations a little bit more, especially in the last section of the trail when it was starting to get a bit cold, because I wanted to have as much grain as possible for her. And so, that last section of trail, I rationed myself down to, which is not recommended, by the way, but I rationed myself down to about 3 trail bars and 1 freeze-dried meal per day, just so I could maximize the grain that I was able to take. There wasn't much to it, and I would definitely prefer to have a pack horse there, just so you're able to take as much as possible. So I also fit as much as I could in the backpack that I was wearing. So when I ride, I have a backpack that I ride with that has everything I need, just in case I get separated from my horses for whatever reason. So I've got the first aid kit, one of those sleeping bag bivvies, the silver ones, and I had a really good one that was tucked away that, it got me down to, I think, 20 degrees, maybe. I'd have to look at that again, but it adds at least 10 degrees to your sleeping bag if you did use it, or it just kind of is going to be able to keep you alive out there. And I had everything I needed to start a fire if I needed to, and my water filter. And yeah, just all of that. Sorry, I completely lost track of what I was saying for that bit.
No, that's fine. So then I'm still trying to figure in my head how this is working. So you have food on your horse. Are you still riding your horse, or
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
So
So
you have
maybe I'll try that again. Do you mind if I just try and answer that entire question again and start from scratch? Is that
no, it's fine.
okay? I
Actually,
feel like that went all over the place.
no, it's actually really good and interesting. I'm just trying to
Mm-hmm.
work out in my brain the details of it because it's interesting for me this mode of transport because I myself, I wasn't carrying horse feed on my trip. I was just kind of knocking on doors, and Ireland is wet, so there's grass everywhere. So obviously, you're having to carry a lot of weight, and I'm just curious how much weight you're carrying and how it works logistically.
So moving down to one horse obviously cuts down the amount of time that I can spend out in the backcountry before I need to resupply. So the longest I did in between resupplies was 8 days, and that was pushing it. I kind of only meant to do 6 days, but it turned out that the resupply after that was only going to be 2 days later, and I had a friend in Colorado that was helping to resupply me, and we just kind of figured out it would make more sense if I just stretched it out the last 2 days. But ideally what I was trying to do was pack 6 pounds of feed, and I'm not quite sure what that is in kilos off the top of my head, but 6 pounds of feed for Thelm per day. And that was the really that was Purina strategy. So that had a whole bunch of salts and minerals, and then I would graze her as much as possible. So I had this rule that I adopted from Gillian, which is a 12-hour rule in camp. So if you get into camp at, say, 6 p.m., the earliest you can leave is 6 a.m. So I wanted 12 hours each day of uninterrupted time, like downtime and grazing. And what I would do when I was out on trail as well is if we came across this patch of really, really nice grass, then I would stop and let her have a break and eat as much as she wanted to for a set amount of time before we kept going. And so that was the way that I was able to ration my feed out for a little bit longer.
So on the trails, and you're with your one horse now.
Yeah.
Were you covering more distance or less distance with one horse?
We actually covered a little bit more distance, and I think that was a combination of a couple of things. One of them being that I was able to get up and out of camp a lot quicker now that I had one horse. So that was extra time in the day that I was able to use. And Thelma, my mare, she just walks out so fast. And so if we had any obstacles, it was half the time getting around them or over them than it would be otherwise. So we saved time there. And I think another factor in it was just that we were in the routine and we were fit and we knew what we were doing. And so I was just able to keep going that little bit further. And half the time she wasn't ready to stop for camp anyway. She's just an absolute powerhouse. And so there were some days where I ran out of gas long before she did. So, but we were averaging about 40 kilometers a day. The last section that I was on was 3.5 days. So my first day, we spent 7 hours just driving to the trailhead. And so I only did about 4 miles that afternoon, or what's that? I think maybe 7 kilometers, give or take. I just wanted to get out onto trail and find a good campsite. And then, so we did 128 kilometers for those last 3 days. And we did 31,000 feet of elevation change, which I think works out to around about 10 Ks. So we were like flying by the end of it.
I mean, 40 kilometers a day is quite a lot. So it sounds like you were basically sun up till sundown, just going places.
Yeah, well, she, like I said, she walks out really, really well. So she is a quarter horse cross saddlebred. So I'm not sure if that saddlebred had anything to do with it, but she just has this really, really fast walk, and her downhill walk is actually just as fast as on the flat or going uphill, which is funny because usually I like to slow down going down hills. But she, it doesn't feel like a normal walk. and we just absolutely fly. So I think that kind of gave us, actually, you know what, just cut all that little bit out. Let me try that again. Sorry, and that's like, that just sounds so weird. I can't even figure out the right English to explain that. So hold on. Let me go back
You're
again.
wanting me to get paid for this or something, because you're giving me a lot of work.
Oh my gosh, sorry. I'm just trying to put this into the right English. I'm struggling today. No, we were covering a lot of ground, and so I was in the saddle for in between 10 and 11 hours a day on average when we were doing that. So they were long days, but it's just kind of like, once you get trail fit, that just seems to be like what we ended up doing.
And so maybe you could share some, I don't know, highlights or some stories, again, sort of like maybe a moment during this ride where you're like, yes, this is why I'm here, this is why I'm doing this.
Well, a lot of the moments like that came, that are like the, yes, this is why I'm here, this is why I'm doing it, came actually off trail from messages that I got from people that were following this ride, that were able to share their stories with me about their mental health journeys and how I've helped. So a lot of the time, this is why I'm doing this came from the people that I met either physically or online along the way. There was one time where I actually had to come off trail before I meant to. So I busted my stirrup off my saddle when I was in Wyoming. One of the nuts on the side of my stirrup came off, and so when I went to put my full weight on it, it just opened up that stirrup and completely warped it. So I ended up doing a 40k day that day with one stirrup. But I came off trail early, and I came into this little town called Jeffrey City, and the people there were absolutely incredible. So I had a friend with me for the first 2 days on trail, because like the Australian ride, I only bought my horses, this time I only bought them about 2 weeks before I set out on trail, but I'd been riding them for maybe a month or so. So they were really, really new as well. So I had a friend with me for the first 2 days, and we had his truck at the start of the trail and then my truck and trailer at the end where we were expecting to come out. And so we came out a day early because I'd busted my stirrup off. And we came into this tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. And I just walked into this pottery shop on the side of the road and just said, hey, do you happen to know of anyone going to Rollins, which is this little town in Wyoming? Because we have a truck that's just not too far out of there at a trailhead. He's like, yeah, I'll take you. Cool. No worries. And so straight away, closed the shop and then took my friend out to pick up that truck, and I stayed with the horses. And I was thinking, all right, I need to put these guys somewhere. I got to figure this out so I can untack them and get them grazing and all that. And I saw that there was a little bit of room out the back of the bar. And so kind of walked up and looked around, and there was nowhere to tie them. And this guy was just walking out of the bar. And I was like, hey. And he's like, yeah, hi. And I was like, how are you going? He's like, you're Australian. I'm like, I am. He's like, do you need help? I'm like, can you hold my horses, please? And I just passed him both my horses and ran inside the bar. And so I chatted to the bar owner in there, and she said, no worries at all. Just put your horses out the back. I had my electric fence, so I was able to set that up. And she was super helpful. And Rusty, who ended up being the guy that I'd given my horses, he came out the back and held my horses while I set up the electric fence and helped me untack. And I was just chatting about the day and had told him what happened. And I was like, yeah, it was 4 p.m. or 4:30 p.m. by this point. And I was like, yeah, I haven't really had breakfast yet today. I kind of just forgot. And now we're here. He's like, oh, well, I hope you get some good food. And it was just, chatting about life. And so I set up the horses and went back inside and chatted to the bar owner and ordered a burger, because that just seemed like the best possible life decision at that point. And I'd realized I'd left my phone out the back with the horses when I'd taken all of their gear off. So I went out to go and collect that in case my friend needed to call me from picking up the truck. And I ran into Rusty as I was walking out the front door, and he's come back with all of his kids, and he's like, yeah, the kids wanted to meet you, and they brought me like 2 full Tupperware containers of food because they were worried that I was really, really hungry. And it's just moments like that. And so they ended up coming in and we chatted a little bit and hung out, but just moments like that, and those moments on trail and the kindness of strangers that just really, really make everything worth it. So I think what was it? There's a song about this. I think it's a Luke Bryan song where he talks about like the fastest way to lose faith in humanity is to watch the evening news. And if that's the case, then the fastest way to gain faith in humanity is to go out on a trail like this, because the kindness that you experience is just next level.
That's a very good point. Definitely. And so how many months were you on this particular trail, and how many miles did you end up covering?
So this time around, it was very different to my BNT trail. When I was on the BNT, I pretty much got on the trail, and then 2 and a bit months later, I came off the trail, and that was it. Whereas in the States for the CDT, it was a lot more section riding. So I started out in Wyoming in the basin because it was a really big snow year this year. And so according to all of the snow reports, the basin was the place that didn't have snow. I wasn't expecting snow. In saying that, I got snowed on so hard on my first day out there. It was ridiculous, like so hard. And so I did a little section in the basin. And then because I'd busted my stirrup off my saddle and I was in the middle of nowhere, I kind of decided to come off trail a day or two early and get all of that fixed. And by that point, I had a couple of weddings up in Montana, so I decided to, rather than getting on trail and keeping going because there wasn't like a lot more snow forecast, I would just get up to Montana. And so I ended up there, and then Russ, who taught me to pack, I ended up staying with him for a little bit, and we did a couple more practice pack trips with my horses while I was off trail. And I attended 2 friends' weddings in the first 2 weeks of June, so it was a bit hard to get on trail in between them. And so then I did that section in between Butte and Helena, which was a bit over a week, and then I came off trail for a little bit or a couple of days, and then I got back on. So it was just a section here, and I got held up a lot by my truck broke down. I'd be willing to say probably half a dozen times, maybe more. And so that pushed me back a lot as well, having to constantly visit mechanics. So all up, I probably would have done a similar amount of time on trail and done slightly more Ks. So I think I did about 1,200 kilometers, or a bit over 700 miles this time around. So not nearly as much as I wanted to achieve. So I was kind of disappointed about that. But everything happens for a reason, I figured. And it just means that there's more country for me to get back and explore the next time around.
So you had a truck and a horse trailer. Where were you keeping the trailer while you were off on the trail?
So the idea was I would have my horses at the start or the trailhead where I wanted, and then I would drive the truck and trailer up to the next section, like the next trailhead that I wanted to get to, and then hitchhike back. Luckily for me, there was only 2 times where I needed to do that, and the rest of the time I just ended up having friends help me out and get me from one place to the other. So my truck and trailer would be at the next trailhead up most of the time, and so I would just ride to that, resupply, and then repeat that.
I know I could actually keep talking to you for hours, but I'm going to try and wrap it up a little bit. But I would like to know, and I think this is helpful for others as well who are interested in doing something similar, but how are you funding trips like this? I mean, you already mentioned, you had quit your job. So did you have a savings, or what was your plan going into these adventures?
Oh yeah, I've completely wiped out my savings account. That's pretty much it. Yeah. So when I was in corporate land, I was on a pretty decent salary, and I guess growing up, Mum and Dad taught me some really great financial habits. So the majority of my income I actually put towards savings or I invested. And so that just set me up really well. So I was able to pull on that. But now we're back home, back in Australia, and I'm straight back into the working life to try and pay the rest of that trip off, and so that I can save up for the next one.
So do you have a next adventure in sight, or?
I do. So I've got to go back to the States in April. I'm presenting at the Continental Divide Trail Coalition's Trail Days. And so I'll be back over in New Mexico for that. And so while I'm over there, I'm going to grab Thelma, and I haven't quite figured out exactly what trails we're going to do, but I'll see if I can get back out there and go, even if it's just like a small week-long trip. I'll take her out there. And then next year, I'm actually teaming up with Ben Brooksby, who's another mental health advocate over here in rural Australia. And so we are doing a tour. So he's also known as the Naked Farmer, and he does tours around Australia. So last year it was around mainland Australia, and this year it was around Tasmania. And he kind of goes out to local communities and individual farmers and just talks about life on the land, agriculture, and mental health. So have people sharing their own mental health stories. And next year we are teaming up. We're going to be touring together, and we're going to be doing a ride. So it'll be another tour, but this time on horseback instead of in the car. And we're going to be going around southern Queensland and northern New South Wales, around that area. And so we'll be riding for about a month.
So it sounds like you're addicted, huh?
Yeah. This is not where I thought I would be a couple of years ago when I was like back in IT corporate land as an account manager. I had no idea that this is where I was going to be ending up.
Oh, wow. You went from accounting to, a horse adventuress.
Yeah. So it's funny how life kind of just throws you for a six every now and again. And it's like, nope, wrong course, try this one. You're like, oh, okay.
So is there somewhere... Oh, actually, no. Before I ask that, you mentioned at one point your most favoritist, what was it, hiking/riding boots. And I took a little note. I guess you need to tell us the name of that.
Well, they're not technically supposed to be hiking boots, but I easily would have hiked over 300 kilometers in my Ariat Ropers. And those have been the comfiest boots I've ever had. Okay.
Perfect. I'm going to include a link to all of these. I know you gave quite a few useful apps and these things. So I'm going to include all those links in the show notes. But also, where can people follow your crazy adventures? Where's the best place to reach you?
So I update Instagram the most, and my Instagram is green, gold, and blues, all letters. And so the way that kind of came to be was that initially I was supposed to be doing this trip right up the coast of Australia, and Australia is synonymous with green and gold. And because I was doing this for mental health awareness and depression, depression's also known as the blues. So it just became green, gold, and blues. And so that's where you can find me on Instagram.
Perfect. And I know you have a website or blog as well, right?
Yeah, I've got a website, which is just informational, and that's same thing, just greengoldandblues.com.
Perfect. And again, I will share all of these links in the show notes so people can look you up and keep following on your adventures.
Sounds like a plan. I can't wait to get out there again.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. This was a lot of fun, and I'm definitely going to keep following along on your other trips.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You have been listening to the Equestrian Adventuresses podcast. Please subscribe to our channel and check out our website, equestrianadventuresses.com, for links to the show notes. Leave us a review and consider becoming a premium member for bonus episodes and footage. More information can be found on our website. Until next time, adventuresses, happy trails.